I got 18 dimes in each barrel, boy. You ever see what $1.80 can do to a $40 steer? Let alone a cheap little crook like yourself. Just taunt me again, boy. That's all I'm asking. Just taunt me again.
I'll make you famous.
I wouldn't give a bucket of piss for your future.
This is 12 Gauge Investigative. Let's jump in.
All right. Happy Sunday, everybody. My name is 12 Gauge. Welcome to my channel, 12 Gauge Investigative. I'm going to take a break from the Idaho 4. Been going kind of hot and heavy on that topic. If you were in here before, when I was doing the study time, I was talking about community corrections because that's what I am indeed studying. So I thought this lazy Sunday afternoon, I would get on here and I'd read a little bit more and take you along for the ride. Like I said last time, this is a way for me to not only continue to learn this, but to have a lot of different ways to discuss this and be able to learn about it and teach you about it at the same time. So I understand if nobody really wants to come in and watch this one. I totally get it. But if you come in here, please understand I probably won't have a lot of time to interact with you in the chat. I'm going to be reading this and trying to understand it at the same time. So here we go. Last time we left off with prison is expensive. So the other side of the correctional paradox is the correction funding is driven almost completely by public tax dollars. Correctional budgets have been hit hard these last few years due to the part of the most recent economic recession that forced states to cut social programs, initiate hiring freezes, and lay off employees. VERA, Institute of Justice, 2010. In response to the fiscal crisis, state legislators and correctional administrators have considered the following option: decriminalizing lower level nonviolent and or drug felony offenses and reducing them to Class A misdemeanors, repealing mandatory minimums, using more graduated sanctions in the community, increasing discretionary parole rates, changing probation and parole policies for responding to violations, denying requests to incarcerate for anything but new crimes, closing existing housing units within a prison, closing existing prisons together. There is a growing consensus that the use of jail and prison facilities, which are the most expensive option, should be reserved for the most dangerous offenders. At the same time, community-based correctional options should be expanded when regular probation and parole is not enough. In comparison to prisons, probation and parole agencies garnered about 21 cents of every correctional dollar to supervise the 70% of all people under correctional supervision. Table 1.3 showed daily cost per person for selected forms of correctional supervision in the federal system compared to North Carolina, a state with moderate living costs. Incarceration is significantly more expensive than community supervision, especially considering that for the latter, the offender shares some of the costs. For example, probationers subsidize annual costs with monthly fees ranging between $40 and $80. Parole, electronic monitoring, day reporting, and residential community correction facilities are partially subsidized by the offender. Table 1.3, daily cost per person, selected forms of correctional supervision. Prison. Federal is $75.25. North Carolina, $76.02. Pretrial detention, $72.67. North Carolina, none recorded. Pretrial community supervision, $8.21. Not recorded for the other. Residential community facility or residential substance abuse facility, $60.27. For North Carolina, $47.34. Probation, $9.40 federally, $3.57 for North Carolina. Intensive probation, $12.10 federally, $15.27 for North Carolina. Parole, mandatory supervised release, $8.10 federally, $3.44 North Carolina. Community service work program, federally, non-recorded, $1.29 for North Carolina. Day reporting, not recorded, $24.70 for North Carolina. Electronic monitoring, GPS, $10.50 federally. North Carolina is $13.28. So the role of corrections at the three major decision points. The three major decision points in the correction system, bail, sentencing, and reentry, are guided by formal written laws, codes, and statutes, as well as by informal discretion. Discretion is a form of subjective decision making that begins when a victim or witness decides whether or not to report a crime to the police. Some argue that victim discretion plays at least as important of a role as formal law. Another decision point early in the process is the arresting decisions made by law enforcement officer. As seen in Figure 1.2, community corrections play a pivotal role at three major decision points to follow an arrest: pre-trial and a bail decision. After a police officer makes an arrest, the suspect is booked in jail and the prosecutor's office decides whether to charge the suspect with the crime. If the prosecutor chooses not to charge, the suspect is automatically released. If the prosecutor opts to charge, the suspect officially becomes a defendant and goes before a judge, magistrate, or other official authorized to inform the defendant of the charges, determine whether the defendant is requesting appointed counsel, and ascertain whether the defendant is eligible for release from jail. Although most defendants are released on their own recognizance with the promise to appear at their next court date, some defendants must secure their next appearance with bail or monetary payment deposited with the court to ensure their return. When the conditions of the bond have been satisfied, the defendant is released on a bond. Many times, particularly in the federal system, the defendant is released on pretrial supervision, which is a form of correctional supervision of the defendant who had not yet been convicted. Forms of pretrial supervision can include client reporting, house arrest, and electronic monitoring. Pretrial supervision has four functions: bail, monetary payment deposited with a court to ensure a defendant's return for the next court date in exchange for said defendant's release. Pretrial supervision, court-ordered correctional supervision of a defendant not yet convicted, whereby said defendant participates in activities such as reporting, house arrest, and electronic monitoring to ensure appearance of the next court date. So these are some of the diagrams of what happens when somebody is arrested. It starts out with the arrest, initial arraignment, pretrial detention, which can go to diversion, therapeutic problem solving court, drug court, mental health court, DWI court, or it can go down to sentencing, which is direct sentencing, halfway back option for probation violation, and it goes down here. Or it can go to supervised probation, residential treatment, boot camp, intensive supervision, probation, other conditions, as we spoke on last time, ignition, interlock, forfeiture, day reporting, a GPS monitor, UAs, community service, restitution, fees, liaisons, and fines. Then we get to imprisonment. Let's go down to pre-release or reentry, parole, pre-release, halfway house, or, or for parole violations, it goes into parole violator units. Or they can go back to a halfway house, boot camp, community residential center, or home confinement. So these are the four. It said 1, accounts for a defendant's whereabouts to keep the community safe. 2, allow the defendant to prepare for upcoming court appearances. Allow the defendant to continue working and supporting defendant, and keep bed space in jail available for defendants who may not be eligible for release. Sentencing decision. Community corrections agencies and programs perform the important function of implementing the sentence imposed by a judge. At a basic level, a correctional sentence is a social control mechanism for convicted offenders, and it also keeps citizens law-abiding through general deterrence. While incarceration serves an important purpose for offenders who are dangerous or who have committed violent crimes, the vast majority of crimes are nonviolent or related to drug use and can be responded to in ways other than imprisonment. This is really true because a lot of times you do have a lot more drug related offenses, or I don't like to use the word minor, but the heavy hitters are murder, rape, arson, and the lower levels would be burglary of a habitation, breaking and entering, you know, not really grand theft, but you know, unlawful joyriding, something like that. Judges and prosecutors need a variety of probationary or front-end punishments from which to choose, and community correction programs offer a diversity of sentencing options. The community-based punishments shown earlier in Figure 1.1 are known as intermediate sanctions because they offer graduated levels of supervision. They provide rewards for positive behavior with gradually less supervision when offenders achieve and maintain desired program outcomes. Intermediate sanctions can also impose higher levels of surveillance, supervision, and monitoring than probation alone, but they would provide less supervision than jail or prison. A full range of sentencing options give judges greater latitude to select punishment that closely fit the circumstances of a crime and the offender. We discussed the sentencing decision in Chapter 4 and then devote 6 chapters to the form the community corrections take, beginning with probation and the various graduated residential, monetary, and non-residential sanctions. Here's the definition for intermediate sanctions. A spectrum of community supervision strategies that varies greatly in terms of supervision level and the treatment capacity, ranging from diversion to short-term duration in a residential community facility. So when people are getting ready to re-enter the community, this is what the next part is called, the re-entry decision. Over 45 years ago, the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice, 1967, introduced the term reintegration. The Commission's report stated that institutions tend to isolate offenders from society, both physically and psychologically, cutting them off from school, job, families, and other supportive influences and increasing the probability that the label of criminal will be indelibly impressed upon them. The goal of reintegration is likely to be furthered much more readily by working with offenders in the community than incarceration. The Commission called on the community to provide needed employment and educational opportunities while community correctional workers act as advocates to link offenders to programs and monitor their progress. This goal still holds true today, though instead of reintegration, we use the term reentry. Reentry requires an offender adapting to a community setting to participate in programs to develop legitimate accomplishments and opportunities. Although there seems to be less emphasis today on the role of community in assisting in the offender's return, an issue discussed in greater detail in Chapter 11. Some of the reentry programs that might be available for somebody who's incarcerated could be GED, it could be drug treatment, it could be avenues such like that, life skills, parenting, generalized program to assist the offender into the reentry progress process, whether it be budgeting, whether it be, filling out an application, learning how to do a resume, stuff like that. Approximately 95 to 97% of prisoners incarcerated today will one day leave prison and rejoin the larger society. A community of correction serves an important purpose by assisting prisoners in community reentry after their incarceration. Prisoner reentry is an activity or program that prepares former prisoners to live as law abiding citizens upon their return to the community. Prisoner reentry applies to prisoners released automatically based on mandatory statutes, as well as to prisoners released early at a parole board discretion. So, once again, the prisoner reentry definition is any activity or program conducted to prepare prisoners to return safely to a community and to live as law-abiding citizens. Pre-release program. A pre-release program is a minimum security institutional setting for prison offenders who have already spent some time in prison and are nearing release. Pre-release offenders are chosen by corrections officials and transferred to a different type of residential program that offenders can complete in a shorter duration than if they had served their full prison sentence. Pre-release programs are considered more treatment-oriented than prison. Examples of these programs are halfway houses, boot camps, and therapeutic communities that are located inside a prison, separate from the general prisoner population. The purpose of the back-end programs in which participants are diverted from prison is to save money and prison space while also providing program participants with a specialized treatment regimen. Examples of pre-release programs are discussed in Chapter 8. Well, here in Texas, we have specialized prisons that do offer some of these. In case you're a substance abuser, we have a DWI unit, we have Safe P unit, we have treatment on alternative to incarceration program. We have also what's called Jesus, my mind just went blank. SACP program, which is a 45 to 90-day program. Um, Substance abuse punishment corrections. Um, and these are programs that can assist the offender into reentry. That way they don't have to attend these programs out here in the community. The pre-release program is a minimum security community-based or institutional setting for offenders who may have spent time in prison and are nearing release. Its focus includes transitioning, securing a job, and reestablishing family connections. Parole. Parole is a discretionary release of an offender. under conditions established by the patrolling or paroling authority before the expiration of the offender's sentence. Parole is in many ways similar to probation. Both involve supervised release into a community and the possibility of revocation should the parolee or probationer violate the conditions of release. Although some technical differences do exist, the primary difference is that probation is supervision in the community instead of incarceration, whereas parole is supervised release after a portion of the prison sentence has been served. When the Federal Bureau of Prisons abolished its parole board, prisoners left prison on supervised release that was defined by mandatory provision or by sentencing guidelines rather than by subjectivity. Parole is the early privileged release from a penal or correctional institution of a convicted offender in the continued custody of the state to serve a remainder of his or her sentence under supervision in a community. Here are some of the theories behind the community correctional goals. The field of criminal justice and criminology had a wide variety of different theories that attempt to explain human behavior. Criminological theories explain why people commit crime. These theories include biological determinants, psychological factors, rational choice, lack of conventional bond to society, social learning, associating with criminal peers, lack of opportunities, breakdown of social norms, and a reaction to societal labels. While it is important to understand these theories, most criminal justice majors are required to take a separate class that examines these reasons in detail. So these theories will not be repeated here, thank God. Instead, the theories examined in this text will be directed more toward the goals in community correction supervision strive toward in carrying out the sentence of the court or the parole board. These goals are protecting the public through recidivism reduction and specific deterrence, rehabilitation through effective treatment, and repairing the harm done to the victim and overall community. We introduced the theories here and addressed each in greater detail in the future chapters. Protecting the public through specific deterrence. Most offenders have shown by their offenses they cannot easily conform to the norms of society. One of the goals of community-based corrections, therefore, is to help offenders conform to behavioral expectations while keeping public safety in mind. The means by which this goal is reached is based on specific deterrence theory. Specific deterrence attempts to keep supervised offenders from falling back into old habits and behaviors by supervision, unannounced visits, and letting offenders know in advance what the consequences will be for their actions. This theory assumes that offenders, like all people, consider the cost and benefits of their actions, provided the consequences for misbehavior are certain and severe enough that the sanctions outweigh the benefits. The offender will refrain from committing technical violations and or new crimes. This means the courts or paroling authorities must be willing to stand behind the rules and revoke supervision if a new crime is committed. Behaviors that constitute probation and parole violations are covered in Chapter 7. Perceptions that offenders have of the likelihood of getting caught, along with the certainty and severity of revocation, seem to have an impact on their actions. So, in theory, when somebody is paroled, they get these parole rules, so to speak. They're what you can do, what you can't do, where you can be, where you can't be. You're still being supervised by the officers of the court. So that's what they call us as well, the officer of the court, because we're supervising these individuals in a capacity that we're making sure they're staying to addressing the areas needed for reentry, not only for reentry, but to not constitute any areas of recidivism that could take them back into reoffending or absconding from their parole or probation requirements. Rehabilitation through risk, need, or responsibility. A second goal of community correction program is rehabilitation or to correct some of the inadequacies of offenders linked to their criminal behavior and continued involvement in the criminal justice system. Some of these problems include, but are not limited to, drug or alcohol addiction, lack of emotional control, inadequate education or vocational training, lack of parenting skills, and mental illness or developmental disabilities. Correctional treatment or programming is the means by which offenders can receive assistance for their problems to reduce further criminal behavior. An underlying assumption of rehabilitation is that behavioral change is possible. Offenders should have an opportunity to change, and they must have a genuine desire to change, to complete the mental, emotional, and sometimes spiritual work to promote a personal transformation. Individual motivation is an important point because some offenders are not yet ready to change or do not respond to treatment but may be ready later. That is a huge point because all the treatment, all the services that you provide, if someone is not ready, they're not going to take you up on that offer. And not everybody is ready to be rehabilitated because some people have not ever been habilitated, which means they didn't have the initial foundation to have these rehabilitative tools that you're giving them to fix something that was never there. Rehabilitation is the primary goal of the correction system and the process in which offenders are exposed to treatment, programs, and skills training in order to change their thinking processes and behaviors. The basis of effective rehabilitation is a theory of risk, need, and responsivity, R&R, initially proposed by Andrews, Bonta, and Hodge in 1990. R&R suggests the rehabilitation efforts are most effective when they focus on treating high-risk offenders and leaving low-risk offenders alone. Yeah, because you don't want to create obstacles that aren't already there. And when they match correctional interventions with criminogenic needs, which are any problem or deficit that is directly related to criminal behavior. The third principle in responsivity, and it addresses the most conducive therapeutic environment to achieve the maximum amount of learning and change. A responsive environment addresses the unique learning styles and characteristics of offenders, which differ according to gender, marital status, and the education level. Using cognitive behavioral treatment for a long enough duration, 3 to 9 months, is ideal. Using R&R in the intended way has significantly greater effect on reducing recidivism than programs that do not adhere to these standards. Risk, need, responsivity. A theory of rehabilitation that suggests focusing on treating high-risk offenders, matching correctional interventions and criminogenic needs, and implementing treatment according to offenders' learning styles and personal characteristics. Criminogenic needs are problems, habits, or deficits that are directly related to an individual's involvement in criminal behavior. One final point about offering rehabilitation in a community setting. Oftentimes, offenders are more likely to receive treatment under a community correction sentence than in prison. This is partly because prison is less than an ideal setting for rehabilitation to occur. Another reason is financial one. Programs in prison are 100% taxpayer funded, while community-based programs are subsidized by offenders who pay for services as clients. Even as correctional budgets have tightened and and prison treatment programs have been trimmed, taxpayers are bearing less of the cost for offender treatment in the community. And that is true. Just like anything else, if you're going to pay for something, you're going to get the most out of it, right? If you're getting it for free, most people are not going to give their best. Healing the victim and community through restorative justice. Community-based sanctions provide offenders opportunity to repay their victims and their communities. A different philosophy of justice emerged in the 1970s known as restorative justice. Restorative justice is centered on the victims of crime throughout the criminal justice process and emphasizes the responsibility of offenders to repair the injustice they have caused their victims. So, restorative justice is basically various sentencing philosophies and practices that emphasize an offender's taking of responsibility to repair harm done to a victim and the surrounding community, including forms of victim offender mediation, reparation panels, circle sentencing, and monetary sanctions. When a crime is committed, the offender harmed both the individual victim and the community at large. Through a variety of techniques such as community boards, mediation, and face to face meetings with victims, restorative justice attempts to strengthen the community life by drawing on victim compassion and on the strength that offenders bring. Albright and Armour, 2010. Local volunteers in the faith community agree to mentor or assist in the supervision of an offender's reparation. The offender is not publicly shamed or humiliated, but must repair the damage through community service, providing victim restitution, and participating in victim impact panels and other educational programs. Restorative justice is most effective for nonviolent crimes committed by juveniles or first-time adult felonies offenders, in part because the victim is compensated for property losses. What many victims may not realize is although incarcerating offenders for property crime will provide a loss of temporary freedom for the offender, the victim will rarely, if ever, be compensated. When given a choice between compensation and incarceration, most people would rather be compensated for a property crime than demand the offender be incarcerated. At this time, however, restorative justice is less likely to be endorsed for violent crimes. Community-based correction programs that guide restorative justice processes are discussed in Chapter 10. In sum, community correction programs are important because its sanctions provide options for individuals who have committed a crime but do not pose a serious threat to the community's safety. Community-based corrections seek to sanction offenders through punishment while also attempting to improve individual life circumstances. Decreasing risk, increasing rehabilitation, and restoring justice are important aspects of changing offenders' attitudes and behaviors, leading to the prevention of criminal behavior. And that is the goal. That is the goal right there because you want people to stop committing crimes and to quit being incarcerated. That's the goal of all this. But there's so much that goes along to it. It's very difficult to get people to see that there is a better way. Community corrections also serve to ease institutional crowding in jails and prisons by drawing from the population of convicted offenders those predicted to be less risk to the outside community. An integrated theory of community supervision, the participation process model. So you see, when I talk in my lives and when I talk in, doing cases and stuff, I know that I'm very new in all this, but there are different procedural and models that are used in different types of crimes, how the process goes, and it's just not cut and dry. It's not like You arrest somebody or you release them. It's not based on one or the other. It's based on a lot of different factors that determine whether the person's even eligible for bail. When they go before a magistrate or a judge, and how they'll plead for the crime and all this other stuff. And it's a process. But many people in the true crime community do not understand that process. And they have this mentality that if you raise enough hell on social media, that could lead to somebody's release from current incarceration. And it would never happen. And if it does in the future, that's a sad world we'll eventually live in. But, I don't want to get into that. So there's different processes that go along with all this stuff. And it's not just talking about one specific area. So when individuals are talking about criminal justice, forensic psychology, all the aspects of the criminal justice umbrella, it's different avenues of specialization that you learn in these aspects to the whole criminal justice forum. So it's just not one specific thing that you're going to learn. So when people are talking about, okay, let's take the Idaho 4 case, because people seem to relate to that one a lot more. The individual was a criminal justice major, okay? And he specialized in forensic cloud um, area. So that was his specialty. So how people are getting that he learned how to commit a crime without getting caught would only apply if he was utilizing his education based on the digital portion of not being caught. The other stuff, of course, you're going to learn the investigative basics, but unless you go into deep levels of specialty in this field, you're only going to learn the very basics, the upper echelon of the education. But if you specialize, such as getting the master's, getting the doctorate, then you're going to be specialized in this one particular area, which in his case was the digital computer based forensic genre. So if the police were searching anywhere, they would have been searching what kind of computer attributes could have led to this crime. Was that the motive? Was that the intent? So it's interesting for people to really understand this. Otherwise, they're really never going to really get to the point of the whole process. And it's a long process. It's not something that you can learn in a year, 2 years, and be an expert at it if you've never deep dove into it and actually learned it. You know what I mean? Reading documents and things like that, it's beneficial, but just because you can comprehend a document does not make you an expert at understanding the modality of the document, what the document is meaning in regard to the law, in regard to the judicial process, in regard to all these other areas. I myself am not proficient in these areas whatsoever, and I've stated that multiple times because this is all brand new to me. But, you know, there seems to be a lot of individuals that appear to believe that they're capable of integrating their knowledge into these areas, and they have very basic understanding of the whole process. But I'm not going to go into all that. I'm trying to study an integrated theory of community supervision, the participant process model. The more comprehensively explain how community supervision practices can influence a successful outcome, Craig Schwabe, 2012, interviewed probation officers about what they do and proposed what might be the first attempt at developing an integrated theory of how probation works. He called his theory the participation process model. Participation process assumes At a basic level, that offender compliance and active participation are integral to the offender's own success on community supervision, and that's what you want. You want it to be their ability to give more than what the probation officer has to give. You're supervising, meaning that you're standing on the sidelines for any area that they might need assistance in because it's being driven by them. If the probation officer is having to hound them to come in, to report, to give clean UAs, to attend their classes, to do this, to do that, to get their GED, to get their driver's license, to do this, do that, then the probation officer is running the program for them. The offender is not. And most of the time, that causes resentment in the offender's minds because they feel like they're being hounded. So, participation process assumes at a basic level the offender compliance and active participation are integral in the offender's own success on community supervision. Without these two elements, there will be no successful outcome. And of course, for youth, parental compliance and participation is also important. Second, participation process theory suggests that three goals of community supervision are offender accountability, offender risk need reduction, and public safety, which is consistent with deterrence and in our theory discussed earlier. Third, probation and parole officers use strategies such as communication, casework, and leverage to achieve goals. Communication includes listening, clarifying expectation, giving praise, encouragement for desirable behavior, and confronting offenders for undesirable behavior. Casework strategies include assessing problems, establishing long range goals, and assisting the client with implementing steps to meet these goals. Leverage is aversive sanctions, either applied or threatened, that are imposed by courts and probation officers as a consequence for rule breaking or rule violating behavior. These strategies will be discussed further in Chapter 5. Finally, the change process is mediated by the amount of motivation the offender has, the level of parental support, or the degree of positive support from a significant other, and the quality of the officer-client relationship. Schwably believes that the theory is still a work in progress and hopes that through further testing our hypothesis, the probation strategies and mediators, this will lead to development of increasing successful client outcomes through increased completion rates that reduce recidivism. So, I think I'm going to stop right there because my throat's starting to get dry. But I will be back later on to discuss some other stuff and maybe have a guest on or so. But when it comes to these aspects of criminal justice and the knowledge gained, it's a very deep process. It's broken down in different levels because you start off with the three branches of government, which is judicial, um, golly, my mind is just gone. Judicial, executive, and legislative. So whenever you go into those aspects, they kind of branch out into different levels, all the way down to this that we're talking about. And I've had to learn each of this stuff along the way. And what I'm doing right now, what I'm reading on right now, the capstone, that is kind of what Mr. Koberger had to do on his final exam, is put all this stuff together and give a, I don't know if I'm going to have to do it or not, but I might have to do the same thing. Give a hypothetical crime that happened and kind of write a paper on it. I hope. I don't, but I mean, I'm prepared for it. So I hope you guys get a little bit out of, these study times, because it is what it is. I'm bringing you into these study times at the very end. So a lot of times it's not going to make sense unless you already understand what led up to this point. So I'll be back with some true crime stuff probably in a couple of hours. So y'all be looking for a notification, and I hope that y'all enjoyed that. And let's hear a little bit from my friend the Joker.
I'm gonna make this pencil disappear. It's gone. If you're good at something, never do it for free.